The last hour of a night shift always lies. It tells you you're almost done, that the end is near, that all you have to do is hold on a little longer. And then the last hour stretches like taffy, thin and interminable, until a man begins to wonder whether morning is something he invented. David Carter had been telling himself almost done for the past 40 minutes. He stood near the service entrance of the Whitmore Tower on Callaway Street, a glass and steel column that housed 4 floors of corporate offices above a lobby that smelled of new carpet and money. His job was to be visible, to stand near the door in a dark uniform with a silver badge on his chest and make the building's inhabitants feel safe enough to take the elevator alone after 10 o'clock. It was not complicated work. It required no college degree, no specialized training, at least, not officially. It paid $17 an hour, which was not enough, and was also everything. David was 34 years old. He had a face that people described as serious, even when he was smiling, with dark brown eyes set under a heavy brow and a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown. He wore his hair short because it was easier. He kept his uniform pressed because it was the right thing to do. He was 6 feet and change, lean in the way that men who don't eat enough get lean, not gym lean, but work lean, the leanness of a body that burns more than it receives. His phone showed 2:47 a.m. In 4 hours and 13 minutes, he needed to be standing outside Birchwood Elementary on Fenwick Road to pick up his daughter from the early drop-off program. Her name was Lily. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's red hair and his stubborn chin, and she thought that macaroni and cheese counted as a complete meal in all 4 food groups. And she fell asleep every night, clutching a stuffed rabbit named Gerald, who had one eye missing and a permanent coffee stain on his left ear that dated back to an incident involving David's travel mug and the front seat of a truck. Lily was the reason he pressed his uniform. Lily was the reason he said yes sir and no sir to men half his caliber. Lily was the reason he took the extra Sunday shift, and the reason he had not, in 3 years, called in sick a single time. He thought about her now, as he signed out, nodded to the overnight receptionist, a young man named Patrick, who always had his textbooks open on the desk and always looked slightly ashamed of them, and pushed through the glass door into the cold. Cincinnati in February was a particular kind of cold. Not the dramatic Arctic cold of the movies, not howling winds and horizontal snow. It was a quiet, patient cold that moved in under your collar and sat against the back of your neck like a blade kept cool in still water. The sky had the orange-gray cast of a city that never fully darkens, and the street was slick from an earlier freezing rain, reflecting the streetlights in long, wobbling lines. David had a 15-minute walk to where he'd parked his truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with 160,000 miles on it and a heater that worked on a mood. He turned up his collar, tucked his chin, and walked. He had grown up in Columbus, 2 hours east, the second of 3 boys born to a family that fixed what was broken rather than replacing it. His father had been a mechanic. His mother had taught 4th grade. They were not remarkable people in any way the world rewards, but they were steady, and steady had counted for a great deal in that house. He had inherited their steadiness and their stubbornness, and his mother always said their refusal to walk past something that needed doing. He'd spent 6 years in the Army, 2 deployments, and come back quiet in a way that wasn't there before. He met a woman named Claire who understood the quiet without asking him to explain it. And they had 3 good years. And then Lily. And then Claire was gone, not to another man, not to any dramatic ending, but to a blood clot in her brain on a Tuesday morning in October, when Lily was 4 years old, and David was at work, and the babysitter called him, and the whole architecture of his life came down in an afternoon. He did not talk about this. He talked about Lily's spelling tests, and whether the truck needed new tires, and whether the Bengals had any reasonable hope of a decent season. He talked about the practical and the immediate. The rest he kept in a room inside himself with the door closed. He was 2 blocks from where he'd parked when he heard it. It was not dramatic, the way things are dramatic in films. There was no swelling score, no sudden silence in the world around him. There was only a sound, high, sharp, cut off, coming from somewhere to his left, in the direction of Alderton Alley, a narrow service corridor that ran between the back of a restaurant and a row of storage units. David stopped walking. His breath made a small white cloud in front of him. He stood very still, the way he had learned to stand still, not frozen, but calibrated. Every sense directed outward. Silence, wind, a distant car. Then it came again, lower this time, a voice, female. Not screaming now but saying something stop, or please, the words too muffled by distance and brick walls to be certain, but the shape of distress unmistakable. David's jaw tightened. He checked the time. 2:50, 1 a.m. He pulled out his phone and looked at it for one full second. He could call 911. He should call 911. Response time to this neighborhood at this hour was somewhere between 8 and 14 minutes. He knew this not from statistics but from experience. He called 911. He said the alley name, the cross street. Possible assault in progress. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. He said he would. He put the phone in his breast pocket, with the call still open so they could hear what was happening. And he walked toward the alley. Later, people would ask him why he didn't just wait. He had thought about this answer enough times that it came to him automatically now, though he had never spoken it aloud to anyone. Because the second sound was weaker than the first, and when they get weaker, you don't have 14 minutes. The entrance to Alderton Alley was marked by a single sodium light on a conduit bracket bolted to the restaurant's brick wall. The light was not broken, but it flickered some fault in its ballast, some loose wire, and the flickering created a strobing half-darkness that was in some ways worse than complete dark because it played tricks with depth and distance. David did not hesitate at the entrance. Hesitation was a different thing from caution. Caution was useful. Hesitation was not. He moved in quickly, keeping to the left wall, letting his eyes adjust to the alternating light. 30 feet in, he saw them. There were two of them, young men, early 20s, and one of them had the woman against the wall with her wrist in his hand and his other arm across her collarbone, and the second man was standing back with his phone out, whether to use as a weapon or for another reason David did not let himself think about, because thinking about it would slow him down. The woman was on the ground now. She had slipped or been pushed, and one knee was on the wet pavement, and her coat was torn at the shoulder, and her hair was across her face. She was not screaming anymore. She had gone quiet in that particular way that people go quiet when their body has started conserving resources. David assessed all of this in approximately 2 seconds. He did not announce himself. He did not say hey or stop or police. Announcement was for situations where the declaration itself could change the outcome. This was not that situation. He moved to the man with the phone first, because the phone was an unknown. It could be nothing. It could be a recording. It could be that the man was calling someone. He came in from the right, outside the man's peripheral field, and he took the phone with his right hand and the man's collar with his left, and he introduced the man's face to the alley wall with a controlled but persuasive amount of force. The man crumpled without a sound, except for the phone shattering on the ground. The first man, the one who had the woman, turned at the sound. David was already moving. He registered the flash of something metallic, a knife, 4-inch blade, held low the way that suggested some familiarity with using it, and adjusted accordingly. He did not try to grab the wrist. He stepped inside the arc of the strike, redirected the elbow, and put the man down with a controlled takedown that used the man's own momentum and the uncooperative surface of the wet pavement. The man tried to rise. David put a knee on the center of his back with enough weight to make rising unproductive, took the knife, and set it on top of a nearby dumpster well out of reach. 18 seconds, start to finish. He was breathing harder than he'd like to admit. He turned to the woman. She was still on the ground, and she was shaking, not crying, shaking. Which was different, and in some ways more alarming. Her face was pale, and there was a cut above her left eyebrow that was bleeding in that insistent way that head wounds bleed, more dramatic than serious, but still bleeding. Her eyes were open and tracking him. That was good. I'm not going to hurt you, David said. He kept his voice low and even. The way you talk to someone whose nervous system is in crisis, calm enough to anchor. Not so soft it sounds false. I called 911. They're coming. Can you tell me your name? She blinked. Her lips moved. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush. Alexandra," she said. And then, as if correcting herself, "Sophie." He noted the correction but did not remark on it. "Okay, Sophie, I'm David. Can you tell me if you hit your head? Beyond that cut. Did anything else happen?" She reached up and touched the side of her head, wincing. "I fell. When he—" She stopped. "That's enough. Don't worry about explaining anything right now." He was already pulling off his outer uniform jacket. "This is going to feel cold. I'm sorry." He pressed the folded jacket against the cut above her eyebrow. "Hold this here." Firm pressure. She did. Her hand was steady, which he took as a positive sign. Behind him, the man on the ground was starting to find his breath again. David glanced back, assessed that the man was winded and disoriented, but not seriously injured, and turned his attention back to Sophie. "Can you stand? We should move to the alley entrance where the 911 dispatcher can get the address faster from the responding unit." She nodded. He helped her up, supporting her by the elbow, not gripping, and they walked together toward the sodium light at the alley entrance. Sophie was limping slightly on her right side. Her coat, dark wool, had a long tear at the left shoulder. She was wearing what looked like it had been, earlier in the evening, an expensive outfit, a silk blouse under the coat, dark trousers, heels that were ill-suited to February pavement. A young woman dressed to be somewhere important, David thought, who had ended up somewhere terrible instead. The siren started 3 minutes later. By that time, David had checked Sophie's pupils for response and determined she was not concussed. He had also, very quietly, told the 911 dispatcher that there were 2 individuals in the alley who needed to be secured, that one had possessed a knife, now located on top of a green dumpster, and that he himself was an uninvolved bystander and not a threat. The first patrol car arrived at the alley entrance, with its lights washing everything blue and white. David put his hands visible and away from his body and waited. He spent an hour at Cincinnati General. He had not planned to stay that long. He had thought, give the statement, decline the hero treatment, leave. But the officer who took his statement, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who wrote very slowly and asked questions twice, seemed constitutionally incapable of being brief, and by the time David finished, he had been sitting in the waiting area for 40 minutes, and his back ached, and his hands had finally stopped the low-grade tremor that happened after the adrenaline left. Sophie had been taken in for examination almost immediately. There were people with her, a woman who arrived in a black SUV 7 minutes after the ambulance, and who moved through the emergency department with the practiced authority of someone who knew how hospitals worked, because she had spent money to make sure she did. Behind the woman, 2 men in dark coats, who were not doctors and not police. Security, David thought. Private security, expensive kind. He did not comment on any of this. He sat in a plastic chair and drank a cup of coffee from a vending machine that tasted like warm cardboard and waited for Briggs to finish his paperwork. When Briggs finally released him at 4:15 a.m., David stood, put on the jacket he'd gotten back from the nurse who had used it as a compress. It had a dark stain now, probably ruined, and walked to the elevator. A nurse stopped him near the lobby. Young woman. Brisk. Professional. "Excuse me. Were you the one who brought in the young woman from the alley? Are you David Carter? I gave a statement already. I know. She wanted me to tell you thank you. She asked if you'd wait." David looked at the elevator doors. He thought about Lily, who would be awake in 2.5 hours, and who needed her lunch packed and who had a spelling test today that she had been nervous about since Monday. "Tell her I'm glad she's okay," he said. "Tell her not to worry about the jacket." He went home. He didn't turn on the news in the morning. He never did. The news in the morning was a way to import other people's crises into your kitchen. And David had enough of his own. He made Lily's lunch turkey sandwich, apple slices, the good crackers she liked, a note on a folded piece of paper that said, "You know more than you think you do. Good luck on your test. Love, Dad," and drove her to school. And came home and slept for 4 hours. and woke up to 17 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. He did not return the calls. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the city through the window, which showed him a gray sky and the back wall of the neighboring building and a fire escape that someone had planted a dead geranium on, probably in summer, and forgotten. The missed calls started to make sense 3 days later when his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Helen who watched Lily on Tuesday afternoons, knocked on his door with a newspaper. "Is this you?" she asked. The paper was the Cincinnati Enquirer. The headline on page 3 read, "Sinclair heiress attacked in downtown alley. Suspect charged." Below the headline was a photograph of Sophie, only that wasn't her name. The caption read, "Emily Sinclair, 26, daughter of Harlan Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Capital Group." The article was brief. Emily Sinclair had been attacked late Wednesday night in Alderton Alley by 2 men who had subsequently been charged with assault and robbery. She had been treated at Cincinnati General and released. A spokesperson for the Sinclair family thanked a private individual whose quick action prevented the situation from becoming significantly worse. David looked at the photograph for a long time. He had not recognized the name Sinclair in the alley, which was perhaps not surprising because he did not follow business news. He recognized it now, vaguely, in the way one recognizes a name that has been in the periphery of awareness for a long time, without ever requiring direct attention. Sinclair Capital was, as best he understood it, one of the larger private equity firms in the Midwest. Harlan Sinclair was a man whose photograph appeared periodically in magazine racks at the grocery store. "I wasn't the only one there," David told Helen. "The police handled it." Helen looked at him with the focused skepticism of a woman who had taught children for 35 years and knew a deflection when she heard one. "The article says the attacker was already on the ground when police arrived. Pavement slippery this time of year." Helen handed him the paper and went back to her apartment. David sat down and read the article again, more carefully this time. Then he looked up the missed calls. The number was a Cincinnati area code, no name in his contacts. He did not call it back. He told himself, "Stay out of it. You did what needed doing. That's the end of it. Go back to your life." He was wrong about that, of course. The first time he noticed the gray sedan, it was Thursday evening, parked across from his building when he left for his shift. He noted it the way he noted everything, cataloged it, tagged it as potentially interesting, filed it under probably nothing. The second time was Saturday afternoon, when he took Lily to the park on Renner Street. Same sedan, different parking space, same car. He had the plate in his memory from the first sighting. A reflexive habit from years of training that had never quite turned off. He did not react visibly. He pushed Lily on the swings, caught the frisbee she threw badly, shared the bag of pretzels she had insisted on bringing because she believed pretzels were the ideal park food, and drove home the long way, watching the mirrors. The sedan did not follow the long way, but it was back outside his building the next morning. On Sunday night, he called a man he had not spoken to in 4 years. Marcus Webb had served with David in the 10th Mountain Division, 2 deployments, and had come back to Cleveland and opened a private security consulting firm. He was the sort of man who returned calls within the hour, regardless of when you placed them. "David Carter," Marcus said. "You either need a job or you're in trouble. I need to know who owns a gray 21 Accord, Ohio plates." He read the plate number from memory. There was a pause. Then, "Why? It's been parked outside my building for 4 days. Followed me to the park Saturday. Send me a photo if you can get one. Give me 24 hours. Marcus called back in 11. The car was registered to a shell company that, when you traced it through 3 layers of LLC filings, landed at the front door of a man named Vincent Caruso. Vincent Caruso had 2 prior convictions for aggravated assault and 1 for witness intimidation. He was currently employed, according to public records, as a consultant for a private security firm based in Covington, Kentucky. The same firm, Marcus noted with the precision of a man who understood the significance, that had been founded by a former associate of Donovan Mercer. Donovan Mercer was the name of one of the 2 men David had put on the ground in Alderton Alley. David sat with this information for about 30 seconds. The one who had the knife, Marcus said, without David having said anything. He's got money behind him. Apparently, you have a daughter. I'm aware. A silence. What do you need? He had left the army at 26. The official reason was the end of his contract period and a decision not to re-enlist. The actual reason was more complicated. David had been good at his job in ways that the army values and civilians find unsettling. He was a calm thinker under pressure. He was precise. He had, during his second deployment in a country he was not permitted to name in any official communication, been attached to a unit whose work was less about visible action and more about the kind of quiet problem-solving that nobody writes up in the after-action reports. He came back from that second deployment with certain skills and the knowledge of what those skills were for. And he was not certain he wanted to remain in a context where those skills were continually useful. He wanted a different context. He wanted, specifically, the context in which a man could live at the same address for several years and watch a child grow. He had met Claire 8 months after getting out. She was finishing her nursing degree at Ohio State and working weekends at a coffee shop near the campus where he had been taking a few community college courses in business administration. Something to occupy his hands while figured out what a man without a uniform did with himself. She had dark eyes and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly, like weather. She thought his quietness was interesting rather than off-putting, which was unusual and which he appreciated more than he knew how to say. They were good together in the specific way that two people are good together when they each understand that the other has a private interior that doesn't require constant excavation. She didn't ask him to explain himself, and he didn't ask her to be less competent than she was, which she had apparently run into before. And they built a life around those two small courtesies and were happy. When she died that Tuesday in October, that unbearable ordinary Tuesday, the grief was not the kind that is visible from the outside. It was the underground kind. It went into the foundations. He had kept moving because Lily was 4, and Lily needed someone to keep moving, and he had been, in some technical sense, good at loss. He had lost people before. People he had known and cared about, and there was a mechanism in him for surviving it. But Claire was different from all of those losses, the way structural damage is different from a bruise, and he knew, on a level that he did not permit himself to visit often, that the mechanism was simply running at a cost he had not yet fully accounted for. He had gotten the modest apartment and the night shift in the truck. He had taken careful aim at ordinary, and he had hit it, mostly. Now he sat in his kitchen at 2 in the morning with Lily asleep down the hall and the plate number of a car belonging to a man with a witness intimidation conviction, and he thought about what ordinary meant and what it cost. He thought about Claire, not in the way he thought about her when he was very tired, the grief memory way where she was vivid, and then gone. He thought about what she would say if she were sitting across from him at this kitchen table. She had always been clear-eyed in the way that people who study nursing have to become clear-eyed. Having seen what the body does when things go wrong. You can't protect her by pretending, she would have said. You protect her by dealing with what's actually there. He picked up the phone and called Marcus back. I need to move Lily, he said. Helen, Marcus said immediately, because David had mentioned Helen before, and Marcus had a memory for the architectures of other people's lives, for a week, maybe less. I need to do something about the sedan before it becomes a different kind of problem. And the girl? The Sinclair girl? David looked at the kitchen window. The geranium on the fire escape across the way was still there. Dead and forgotten, but still there. She might be able to help, or her family might. That's an interesting word for it, Marcus said. Help. What would you call it? Alignment of interests. You have information. They have resources. Someone is trying to erase both. A pause. You should call them David. I know. He hung up and sat in the kitchen for another 10 minutes, looking at the window. And then he went down the hall and stood in the doorway of Lily's room. She slept with her face turned to the wall, her red hair loose on the pillow, Gerald the rabbit tucked under her arm. The nightlight cast the room in a soft yellow that made it look like a photograph. He had made her this quiet, this warm, this ordinary and safe. That was the actual work of his life. Not the army, not the deployments, not the things he had been good at in ways that civilians found unsettling. This room. This child. He went back to the kitchen and found the number he had not returned for a week. He moved Lily to Helen's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, framing it as an adventure. Helen had a cat named Biscuit and a collection of 300 jigsaw puzzles and a tendency to let Lily stay up 30 minutes past her bedtime, all of which Lily considered profound luxury. Lily asked no questions. She packed Gerald and her spelling practice book and kissed David on the cheek, and David watched Helen's apartment door close and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hands in his pockets. He went back to his apartment and took the gun out of the lockbox in his closet. He had owned the Glock 19 for 6 years. He maintained it scrupulously. He had a carry permit and had never needed to use it in a civilian context. And he did not plan to. Now the gun was for contingency, not plan. The difference being that the plan was something else entirely. The plan involved Marcus, who had driven down from Cleveland and was currently sitting in a rented car 2 blocks from David's building, and it involved a man named Garrett Hale, who was a detective with the Cincinnati Police Department's Organized Crime Unit, and who had once owed David a favor after a situation in 2019 involving a domestic violence call and a piece of evidence that needed to be handled carefully. Garrett was owed the information that David had assembled over 4 days, the plate number, the connection to Donovan Mercer, and, crucially, the contents of the shattered phone he had taken from the second attacker in the alley. The phone had not been completely destroyed. Marcus, who had contacts in the less official sectors of digital forensics, had recovered enough of it to establish that the attack on Emily Sinclair had not been random. There was a text chain. There was a name, not Mercer, someone above Mercer, that connected to a larger pattern that Garrett, once he saw it, recognized immediately. "This is Aldrich," Garrett said when David showed him the recovered data on a Wednesday morning in a diner on Sycamore Street. "Who's Aldrich?" "Richard Aldrich. He's been on our radar for 2 years. Garrett turned the phone screen toward David. "He's a majority partner in a competing firm to Sinclair Capital. There's been a hostile acquisition attempt for the better part of a year. We never had anything clean to connect him to direct action." He looked up. "This is clean. Then you have it. Do what you need to do." Garrett looked at him with the expression of a detective who has spent 20 years reading people. "You're not going to ask for anything? I'm going to ask that whatever happens moves quickly. I have a daughter staying with a neighbor." "Understood." Garrett pocketed the data. 24 hours, maybe less. It was less. Vincent Caruso, the man in the gray sedan, was picked up the following evening on a probation violation that gave the CPD grounds for a full search of his vehicle and residence. What they found there, combined with the recovered phone data, gave Garrett everything he needed for a warrant. Richard Aldrich was taken into custody at his home in Indian Hill on a Friday morning. David heard about it from Garrett's text. "Done. You and your daughter are clear. Call me sometime." He brought Lily home from Helen's on Saturday, 3 days after Richard Aldrich's arrest. A woman called David on his cell phone. She introduced herself as Patricia Vance, executive assistant to Harlan Sinclair. "Mr. Sinclair would like to meet with you," Patricia said. Her voice had the particular controlled warmth of someone who spent her professional life managing the schedules of people who could not be kept waiting. "At your convenience, of course." "What for?" A brief pause. "His daughter has asked to see you as well." David looked at the ceiling. He was standing in the kitchen, still in the t-shirt he'd slept in, a cup of coffee going cold on the counter. Through the window, the morning was the color of old nickels, that flat, overcast February light that felt less like daylight than like the absence of dark. Lily was at school. The apartment was very quiet. He had spent the past 3 weeks telling himself that the matter was concluded. He had acted. He had given the evidence to the right person. The right person had done the right thing with it, and the outcome was what it should have been. There was nothing further that connected him to Emily Sinclair or her family. The distance was restored, but he had thought about her. Not constantly, not in any way he would have described as troubling, but occasionally the way a detail will surface when you're not trying to retrieve it. The particular quality of the silence she had gone into in the alley after the screaming stopped. The steadiness of her hand holding the jacket to her own wound. The correction she had made. "Alexandra, Sophie." He had never asked about that. "Friday afternoon works," he said. "I have a truck." He told Lily there was a meeting he needed to go to. Lily, who was 8 years old and had recently become deeply interested in the classification of insects, wanted to know if the meeting was boring or interesting. He said he wasn't sure yet. She said that sounded honest and returned to her book about beetles. The Sinclair Capital offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building on 4th Street, which David knew from the outside but had never entered. The lobby was the kind that makes you aware of your shoes, polished stone, tall ceilings, the faint smell of cut flowers from an arrangement the size of a small tree. Patricia Vance met him at the elevator, a composed woman in her 50s who shook his hand with the firmness of someone who had long ago learned that being underestimated was a choice she declined to make. She led him through a series of halls to a conference room, not the corporate kind with a long table and too many chairs, but a smaller room with couches and a window that looked west over the city. Emily Sinclair was already there. She looked different from the alley, obviously. She was dressed properly now, her hair arranged, the cut above her eyebrow healed to a thin pink line that would probably fade entirely within the year. She was looking out the window when David came in, and she turned and stood quickly. And for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked, David thought, like someone who had spent 2 weeks thinking about something she wasn't sure how to say. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, "I asked to see you specifically. My father is going to come in a moment. He has," she paused, "he has things he wants to say and offers he wants to make, and I need you to know before any of that happens that you don't have to accept anything. I don't want you to feel obligated." David looked at her steadily. "How's your head?" She blinked. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a short laugh. Surprised. Genuine, the laugh of a person who had expected something formal and received something else entirely. "Fine," she said. The cut needed 4 stitches. The rest was mostly bruising, and... She stopped. "Shock, I think. It took a while. That's normal." "Is it?" "Yes." There was a sound at the door, and Harlan Sinclair came in. He was a man who had been described in various publications as imposing and formidable, both of which were, David thought, polite translations of large and used to rooms adjusting to his presence. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the careful physical maintenance of a man who understood that his appearance was, among other things, a financial asset. He had his daughter's eyes dark blue, observant, and he looked at David with them for a long moment before extending his hand. "Mr. Carter." His voice was lower than David had expected, and quieter. "My daughter told me what you did. I've also been briefed by the detective Hale on what you did after. The police did the actual work. You gave them what they needed to do it." Harlan sat down across from David, and Emily sat beside her father. "Richard Aldrich has been charged with 3 counts, one of which is conspiracy to commit assault. He will not be conducting any more business that intersects with mine or with my family." A pause. "I owe you a considerable debt." "You don't owe me anything," David said. "I heard a sound and I acted. That's it. Most people hear sounds at 3 in the morning and go home." David had no answer to that, because it was true. "I want to offer you something," Harlan said. "Not as payment, I understand you'd refuse that. As a practical acknowledgement that your current situation and my current needs align." He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who had conducted 10,000 negotiations. "I need someone to head security for a personal portfolio of properties and, separately, for my daughter's personal security detail. It's not a public-facing role. It requires someone who can assess threat, manage personnel, and exercise judgment without needing to be told twice." He named a salary. It was the kind of number that David had to keep a carefully composed expression in order to not visibly react to. "There is also," Harlan continued, "a benefits package. Health coverage, full family coverage, and a company vehicle. The hours are structured. You would finish by 6 in the evening, most days. No overnight shifts." He said this last part without inflection, but he said it looking directly at David. And David understood that Patricia Vance had, at some point, provided her employer with the relevant background. Lily's school pickup was at 3:30 p.m. every weekday. He sat back and looked at the window. The city spread west from here, flat and gray-brown and enormous, stretching to a horizon that was more industrial than scenic. From this height you could see the curve of the highway and, faintly, the green of Renner Park, where he had pushed Lily on the swings, while the gray sedan sat in the parking lot. "I'd want to speak with the people currently in the role," David said finally. "Before I commit to anything, I'd want to understand what the actual day-to-day involves." Harlan nodded. It was a nod, David thought, of a man who respected the due diligence. Emily was looking at David with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude. Exactly, she had already expressed that, and it had the quality of something she'd finished with rather than still carrying. Something else. Something closer to curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. In the alley. You gave me your jacket." She said it as if this were the thing she kept returning to, the detail that had lodged itself in the larger story. "You weren't wearing your own jacket, and it was below freezing. You just handed it to me and didn't comment on it." He shrugged slightly. "You needed it more than I did. That's not an explanation. It's the only one I have." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and something in her expression settled, not closed, but quieter. The expression of a person who has found the answer they were looking for and is deciding what to do with it. He took the job. Not immediately. He spent 10 days asking questions, meeting with the existing security staff, reviewing protocols and schedules, and the specific security requirements of the properties involved. He met with Marcus on a phone call and walked through the offer from the objective distance of someone who was evaluating it as a professional arrangement rather than as a gift. And Marcus, who was constitutionally incapable of sentimentality, said, "It's legitimate. The role is real. Take it." He asked for one modification to the offer, a clause in his contract that the evening security briefings, the ones that ran late, could be delegated to a deputy on the 2 afternoons per week he needed to attend Lily's school events. Harlan Sinclair's lawyer reviewed this request for approximately 3 minutes and agreed to it without comment. He also asked, separately, and not through any lawyer, whether there was a reason Emily Sinclair had told him he didn't have to accept anything before her father came into the room. Patricia Vance relayed this question with what David suspected was some private amusement, and Emily's response came back the same day. "Because most people in that situation feel like they owe something. I didn't want you to feel that way. You did what you did because it was right, not because of who I am. I wanted to make sure anything that happened after was your choice." He thought about that answer for several days. He decided it was a good answer. He gave 3 weeks' notice at Whitmore Tower. Patrick, the overnight receptionist, looked up from his textbooks and said he was sorry to see David go, and then looked immediately surprised at himself for saying so, as if he had not known he felt that way until he said it. David took the Tuesday before his last shift and drove to Birchwood Elementary at 3:30 p.m. and waited in the pickup line, which always moved slowly because there were parents who somehow managed to be surprised every single day by the existence of a car in front of them. He watched the double doors open and watched the children pour out in their bright coats and their backpacks. And when Lily appeared, her red hair visible from 40 yards, Gerald, the rabbit's ear sticking out of her unzipped bag because she had decided Gerald needed to witness after-school events, he felt something that was too large for any word he knew, and so he felt it wordlessly. She climbed into the passenger seat and looked at him. "You're early," she said accusingly. She was deeply attached to routine. "Just a bit. How was the test?" "I got a 93. She buckled her seatbelt with the deliberate satisfaction of someone announcing an achievement they had been confident in all along. "I missed necessary because I put 1 C instead of 2. That's a hard word." "It's really not, Dad. There's a trick. 1 collar, 2 socks. Necessary. 1 C, 2 S's. She demonstrated the logic with her hands, as if she were instructing a slightly slow adult. "I'll remember that," David said. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto Fenwick Road. They drove for a while in the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to fill space. The late afternoon sun came through the windshield at a low angle, winter pale and thin, and lit Lily's hair in a way that made it look like copper wire. "Dad," she said, "Helen said you were in the newspaper." He had been expecting this. A small article. "She said you helped someone. I was nearby when someone needed help." Lily considered this with the philosophical seriousness she brought to most questions. "Did you get scared?" He thought about the flickering sodium light and the sound of a woman's voice going quiet. He thought about his hands on the edge of the dumpster and the strange arithmetic of the seconds he had stood still in the entrance of the alley. "Yes," he said. She seemed satisfied with this. "But you did it anyway." "Yes. That's bravery," she said, in the tone of someone citing a definition they had recently verified. Mrs. Okafor said bravery is when you're scared and you do the thing anyway, not when you're not scared. Mrs. Okafor's right. "I know," Lily said comfortably. She pulled Gerald out of her bag and straightened his remaining eye with a practiced thumb. "Will you make the pasta tonight? The kind with the butter and the peas?" "Sure. Can I do the peas?" "You always do the peas." "I know," she said again. "That's why I'm asking." He made the pasta. She added the peas, which she insisted on doing one at a time when she thought he wasn't watching, though he always was. They ate at the kitchen table, the two of them, with the evening coming in through the window and the city going about its business outside. Indifferent and enormous and, in its own way, entirely beautiful. Later, when Lily was asleep and Gerald was back under her arm and the apartment was quiet, David sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what was different and what was the same. What was the same? This kitchen. This silence. The fire escape across the way, where the dead geranium had finally been removed and replaced with nothing at all, just empty air in a terracotta pot, which was its own kind of presence. The city that never fully darkened. The particular weight of being responsible for another person in a way that had no ending and no insurance policy. What was different? He would finish work before Lily got out of school. He would sit in a parking line that moved slowly because of inattentive parents. He would help her with spelling words and listen to her theories about insects and eat pasta with peas added one at a time and fall asleep at a normal hour in an apartment that would be the same in the morning as it was in the evening. He thought about Emily Sinclair not in a romantic way, or not precisely, though she was a striking woman and he was not incapable of noticing that. He thought about what she had asked him, the thing about the jacket, and his inadequate answer. "You needed it more than I did." That was true, but it wasn't complete. The complete answer was something closer to, "It was cold, and I had a jacket, and you didn't. The rest of it, who you were, whether there was any benefit to me in giving it, didn't factor in because it shouldn't factor in." He had never been able to explain this to anyone in a way that didn't sound like he was congratulating himself. So he didn't try. He rinsed his cup and turned off the light. The apartment was dark except for the glow of the nightlight down the hall and the ambient orange-gray of the city coming through the windows. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to Lily breathe, and then he went to bed. He was not happy in the way that certain stories demand, not lit from within, not transformed, not arrived at any destination that felt like an ending. He was something quieter and perhaps more durable than happiness. He was settled. He was where he was supposed to be. The cold outside pressed against the windows, patient and indifferent. The city turned in its half-sleep. Down the hall, a child held a one-eyed rabbit and dreamed whatever children dream when they have eaten pasta with peas and been kissed goodnight by someone who will still be there in the morning. David Carter lay in the dark and let his body finally, fully rest. He would start the new job on a Monday. Patricia Vance had emailed the first week's schedule, which was reasonable and clearly thought through, and he had read it at the kitchen table with Lily eating cereal across from him, and the domestic normalcy of the two things happening simultaneously, a new beginning arriving via email, while a child argued that the marshmallows in her cereal should count as a separate food group had struck him as something close to grace. He did not know what would come next, precisely. He was not the sort of man who made long forecasts. He knew that Lily would get older, and that Gerald would eventually lose more of his stuffing, and that the truck would eventually require a decision. He knew that the new job would have its difficulties and its days when he wondered if he had made the right call. He knew that the city outside would continue its indifferent and enormous turning, and that most of what happened in it would have nothing to do with him. He would be at the school pickup line at 3:30 p.m. He knew that. And Lily would come through the double doors with Gerald's ear sticking out of her unzipped bag, and she would climb into the truck and buckle her seatbelt with the deliberate satisfaction of someone who always does things in the correct order. And she would tell him something she had learned that day, something about beetles or spelling rules, or the unverifiable theories she had developed about the cafeteria's organizational logic. And he would listen and drive, and the city would recede in the mirrors until it was just another set of lights behind them. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, more than enough.